It's mock draft Monday, and we're breaking down three prospects that showed out at the combine and could add much needed explosiveness to the Falcons' pass rush and offense.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to another episode of Locked On Falcons, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the number one sports podcast network in the galaxy. And of course, I'm your humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew. Been covering the Atlanta Falcons for 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com. RIP, still going strong here on Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And of course, today's daily Atlanta Falcons podcast is a mock draft Monday where we break down someone else's mock draft, throw all the slander, this time at Kevin Knight, my good buddy of the Falcoholic, but he will be my enemy today. No, I'm kidding. But he did a mock draft this past week, breaking down some combine risers, essentially. He did a 7-round mock draft with 5 selections, but we're only going to be talking about the first 3 selections. Sorry to Oregon cornerback Jaden Kennedy and Indiana tight end Riley Nowakowski, who Kevin had as the Falcons' 6th and 7th round picks. You can go check out his write-up on those guys at the link in the description below. But, you know, we're going to be looking at the top 3 selections that Kevin had. And, I know, Kevin didn't have any trades in this. I know as we get closer to the draft, he'll do some more trades. But, the top 3 selections, he had the Falcons taking Malachi Lawrence, the edge rusher out of UCF, in round 2. And then in round 3, he had Chris Brazzell, Chris Brazzell, the second, the wide receiver from Tennessee. And then in round 4, he had the Falcons taking Clemson defensive tackle Damonte Capehart. So let's get into Malachi Lawrence, a guy that tested really well. Kevin being much more enthusiastic about relative athletic score, or RAS, RAS, whatever you want to call it, than I am. We won't get into the reasons why, but we'll get a little bit into the reasons why. But, Malachi Lawrence of the combine testers had the second best RAS of any edge rusher at a 9.9, which basically, based off of RAS, means that he's a 99th percentile athlete for that position. He would have been number 1, but denied. Dennis Sutton is 6'6" versus Lawrence being only 6'4", which is why he had a slightly higher RAS. But that's one of my beefs with RAS. But anyway, 6'6" guy is not inherently more athletic than a 6'4" guy. But that aside, Lawrence measured in at 6'4", 253, ran a 4.52. When you adjust that 40 time for his weight, that was the 3rd best 40 time of edge rushers at the combine. So clearly athletic, clearly explosive. I watched 2 of his games this week. You see the get off, you see the speed coming off the edge that athleticism and explosiveness translates to. He has pretty good bend. He knows how to use his hands and his length to win off the edge. You see chops, you see rips, you see a long arm, you see stab moves, push-pull moves, right? The one question with his pass rush plan is, where's the power, right? And I did see some pop in his hands when it did come to converting speed to power with that explosiveness, but it didn't seem like it was a huge part of his pass rush plan. And we know, as we've discussed so many times on this podcast over the last several years, particularly in the last 3 years, that power is that skill set that immediately translates to the next level and often gives you a much higher floor as a pass rusher or an edge rusher coming into the NFL than some of these other areas. But as we saw with James Pierce and Jalen Walker this past year, playing in this wide 9 scheme under Jeff Ulbrich, that is much more, advantageous for speed rushers that I think Lawrence is. And so in Atlanta, I think he'd be able to come in and produce at a relatively high level compared to maybe some other schemes that do not accentuate that outside speed rush as much as our scheme does. But, as I noted on yesterday's episode when talking about Khalil Mack, I would love to see the Falcons add a little bit more power in their edge room, get some guys that are much better at crushing and collapsing the pocket from the outside at that position. And I think that would really complement the room that they already have. And, it doesn't seem like Lawrence is exactly that type of player, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm out on Lawrence or whatever. I think his skill set is kind of similar to Arnold Ebiketie's skill set, right? More of that technical speed rush guy coming out of college. And I know every time I talk up Arnold Ebiketie on this podcast, I get a lot of comments from people like, "Oh, Aaron, you overrate Arnold Ebiketie and all that stuff." And I think a lot of the negativity towards Arnold Ebiketie is tied to the sack production or the lack thereof, right? The most excited collectively that I think the Falcon fans were about Arnold Ebiketie came going into the 2024 season when he was coming off a 23 season where he had like a 7-game stretch where he had 5.5 sacks, and people got really excited about that. But it's not to say the sack production is a non-issue, but I know I always try to be forgiving of Falcon fans because I know this fan base likes to focus a lot on sack production, but I think and there are reasons because of the last 2 decades of this team being allergic to sacks. So I understand why Falcon fans fixate on that. But I feel like a lot of people just look at it far too black and white than it is. Like there's a lot of gray in there. That's why I'm always like lessening the hype on sack production. But anyway, AK didn't quite live up to the hype. We liked his double-digit sack potential when we drafted him, right? And again, I think he's a lot better than many would give him credit, even though he hasn't lived up to the hype. But I think part of the reason why he hasn't lived up to the hype was the constant defensive coordinator changes. 4 defensive coordinators in 4 years, 4 significant scheme changes in 4 years. But despite that, Arnold Ebiketie did improve across those 4 years. Again, you wouldn't be able to tell that if you only look at the sack production, but if you're watching the film, it's very obvious that he's far better a player these last 2 years than he was starting out his career. And I bring that up just because with a guy like Malachi Lawrence moving forward here in Atlanta, he's coming into hopefully an environment in Atlanta that's going to have a lot more coaching stability, right? Where we're sitting here expecting and wanting to believe that, Jeff Ulbrich is going to be the Falcons defensive coordinator for the next 3 to 4 years. Right now, we know nothing is guaranteed in the NFL. NFL stands for not for long, all that stuff. But you do feel better about betting on defensive players like Lawrence, moving forward and developing at a faster rate and reaching their ceilings here in Atlanta over the next couple of years because they're going to get that schematic continuity, and particularly this type of scheme that we know Jeff Ulbrich runs that really does a great job enhancing the pass rush, right? So it's not necessarily an Arnold Ebiketie do-over if the Falcons were to take Malachi Lawrence in round 2. But, I think the upside of that bet has a higher probability of working out with Lawrence whatnot. And so he has a much greater chance to live up to the hype. And, I know a lot of people are kind of mixed on whether or not the Falcons should invest at edge early in the draft. I typically, my philosophy when it comes to this particular draft, and we'll see, how that philosophy will change and shift over the next, several weeks. We got 7 weeks away from the draft, is, I think the Falcons just need to get good players. And I think I think Malachi Lawrence is a good player. And, while I'm not necessarily, focused on like, oh, we need to draft this position going into the draft, is like, to me, just get good players that, add a lot to this roster and focus on that rather than trying to fill needs, because the Falcons have a lot of needs and it's going to take like 2 off seasons for them to really address a lot of those needs. So basically I'm sitting here saying, like, I think Lawrence is I'm watching some of these edge rushers that are, Derek Moore of Michigan and now Malachi Lawrence of UCF are like 2 that have stood out to me that I'm like, I'm not necessarily all in on taking an edge rusher early in the draft, but if it's one of those guys, like, I feel a lot better about those types of picks at edge rusher. And so Lawrence does check that box. So we'll move the conversation forward, talk about the explosive weapon that the Falcons added in Kevin Knight's mock draft in round 3 in Tennessee wide receiver Chris Brazzell. And we'll talk about if his upside as a deep threat kind of overshadows the concerns coming from him coming out of that Tennessee offense. And we'll do that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So the pressure is high in the NFL, and it is also high in your workplace with deadlines, overflowing inboxes, and that one position that you have to fill sitting wide open when the pressure is on and you need the right hire. Indeed is all you need. Indeed sponsored jobs is going to help you reach the right people who actually fit what you're looking for, so you're not just hoping the right candidate stumbles across your posts. Over the next minute that I'm talking to you, companies like yours will have made 27 hires on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. So if you're hiring, spend less time searching and more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with the right skills, experience, and location by using Indeed sponsored jobs. And you will get a $75 sponsored job credit to help give your job the premium placement it deserves at indeed.com/podcast. Just go to indeed.com/podcast right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? This is a job for Indeed sponsored jobs. So before we continue today's Locked On Falcons Mock Draft Monday, I want to let you guys know that free agency is here, and so are we for you, right? You can get 1 month free of the Everydayer Club with the code free agency, no spaces, now through March 15th. So go ad free, keep this conversation going in the Discord, and get that first month free by hitting that link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. So let's talk about Chris Brazzell. Brazzell Dazzle, right? Big, fast, wide receiver. 6'4", 198 pounds, 4.37 40 at the combine. If you look at his flying 20, which is basically the distance between the 20-yard split and the 40-yard split, right? When you're supposed to be at your top speed, really fast, ran at 1.82 seconds. That's similar to other explosive offensive weapons that you may be familiar with, like Calvin Johnson, Devin Hester, right? Jamal Charles. And if you're old school Falcon fan when it comes to explosive running backs, same as Antone Smith and Jarius Norwood, right? That's faster than Calvin Ridley, Julio Jones, Jamar Chase, and Chris Johnson, right? So he has that build-up speed. You see it with the long strides. And once he gets that build-up speed, he can fly. And that translates to, I think, to his main trait, which is that verticality. He's a big, fast guy that wins downfield. I think that's a very valuable trait and skill set. As we've talked about before, with you want to build a complementary receiver room around Drake London, and adding that type of skill set to that room, is going to be extremely valuable for the Atlanta Falcons, getting a guy that can win in stretch defenses vertically. And Brazzell does have that ability. Now, the knock on Brazzell is going to be mainly the offense he comes from, right? And I know you're going to accuse me of helmet scouting, but this Josh Heupel offense that is in Tennessee has really struggled to produce NFL talent in recent years outside of the offensive line, right? You go back to his time at Missouri with Drew Lock. You go back to his time at UCF with, a young Dylan Gabriel, and now at Tennessee, right? And when you look at the various wide receivers that have played in that offense and made it to the next level so far, and we'll see what maybe this changes, but so far the most successful one has been Gabe Davis from those UCF days. And to me, Gabe Davis is kind of what I think Brazzell is going to be in this league, right? We saw Gabe Davis be a highly effective number 2 wide receiver as a vertical threat for 2 seasons in Buffalo in 22 and 23, where he played with Josh Allen. He played in Ken Dorsey's offense. He led the league in air yards per target during those 2 years. And basically that offense, in a lot of ways, or his usage in that offense, was screw it. Gabe Davis is open down there somewhere from Josh Allen, and he would just sling it, right? But outside of playing in that specific style of offense, we haven't really seen Davis impact a lot of ways in the NFL. And you have another player that Kevin Stefanski is very familiar with that come from this offense, Cedric Tillman, right, from Tennessee. He too has not been super productive over his first 3 years in the NFL. Now, Tillman's best stretch in the NFL came towards the middle portion of the 2024 season, where he had a 4 or 5 game stretch before his season ended with a concussion. And that was around the time when Ken Dorsey, former Bills OC, took over play calling from Kevin Stefanski. And you also had Jameis Winston playing quarterback during that stretch of games. And we know Jameis also has a similar mentality of Josh Allen, where screw it, somebody's open down there somewhere, and oftentimes someone is not open, and it leads to an interception from Jameis Winston. But that sort of aggressive vertical passer, and you saw Tillman really succeed as being much more of a downfield threat during that stretch of the season before his injury. And so when we're talking about this type of receiver, and Brazzell, at least initially in the NFL, like I feel like it's going to be a similar role to Davis and what we talked about with Tillman over that stretch, where if you have the right quarterback, if you have the right play caller that's going to lean into the vertical skill set that he's bringing to the table, he can be productive, right? And again, that's very valuable and useful to this current incarnation of the Falcons offense. And it's not to sit here and say that that's only what Chris Brazzell is going to be, but it's a shortcoming for someone like me who can only evaluate the tape, because if you're going to buy into Chris Brazzell, to me, yes, the physical tools pop and are very intriguing. But if he's going to be more than that, if he's going to be the outlier when it comes to guys coming from this Tennessee offense, it's likely going to be because he has plus intangibles, right? That he's going to need to put in the work because this offense doesn't really do a lot of the things that NFL wide receivers are asked to do, right? Like, you're not reading coverages, your releases and your route tree are pretty basic. I'm sure if you guys have been paying attention to, the Jalen Hyatt's and the Dante Thorntons and, the Cedric Tillmans, et cetera, coming out of Tennessee the last couple of years, you've heard all these complaints, right? And so that type of wide receiver is probably going to be a little bit more of a long-term project, right? Instead of being a guy that's going to hit the ground running in the NFL. And I think, again, Brazzell has the upside that can be developed into a complete wide receiver. But, if he isn't developed into that, right? We always talk about development in the NFL, where often in the NFL, not always, but often in the NFL, you just become a more refined version of the player that you were in college, right? And, if he doesn't develop beyond just being that vertical threat, again, I think that's a very useful skill set to this offense. But I'm not convinced that that's a number 2 wide receiver skill set. Unless you have a play caller, unless you have a quarterback that's really going to lean into it with the aforementioned examples. And so theoretically, the Falcons could do that. They could lean into that. We've seen a version of Cleveland's offense under Kevin Stefanski that was much more vertical, whether we're talking about Jameis Winston, whether we're talking about Baker Mayfield in his first 2 years, whether we're talking about, that run that Joe Flacco went on at the end of the 23 season, where you had quarterbacks that were willing to push the ball down the field, and those offenses were pretty effective, throwing deep shots to Odell Beckham Jr. and Donovan Peoples-Jones and Cedric Tillman and Amari Cooper, et cetera, right? And so you can imagine a scenario where the Falcons build a similar type of offense with Michael Penix, right? Assuming that the deep ball accuracy from Penix improves, right? It was great in 2024 during his rookie season. He was basically the worst deep ball thrower in the NFL in 2025, right? And we believe that, the version of Penix that we should get moving forward should be closer to that 2024 version than the 2025 version. But ultimately, how I feel about a Chris Brazzell pick, would probably depend on context. Like, who else is available in round 3 in this hypothetical situation, right? And I do think he's a better fit in round 3 than round 2, even though the current consensus rankings seem to suggest that he's probably more likely to be in the round 2 mix. We'll see how that ages over the next 7 weeks between now and the draft. But, he's currently in that 7, 8, 9 range when it comes to consensus wide receiver rankings. And we've had 8 straight drafts now where at least 8 wide receivers have gone in the first 2 rounds. Right. Possibly more. But like, when I look at other prospects that are similar to Chris Brazzell, guys like Ted Hurst out of Georgia State, guys like Bryce Lance out of North Dakota State, big, fast guys, but maybe also are kind of raw, right? I kind of like those guys a little bit more. I kind of like those bets a little bit better. And so if those guys are off the board and you basically take Chris Brazzell, that pick feels better. But if you're taking Chris Brazzell ahead of Ted Hurst and ahead of Bryce Lance, I'd be like, I don't know if I agree with that. And so, I know a lot of that bias is built based off my bias towards Tennessee's offense. So, but like, that's kind of how I feel about a Chris Brazzell. So I like the pick, but you really have to, in this isolated situation with Kevin Knight's mock draft, like, I don't know if Ted Hurst was on the board. I don't know if Bryce Lance was on the board. So that would change my opinion on this draft pick, because I don't know if Brazzell is a better bet than those guys. But, that type of receiver, I think, should be available for the Falcons in this round 3 range. So a great opportunity to get a guy like that. But we will wrap up today's episode talking about the 4th round selection, which is Clemson defensive tackle Damonte Capehart, another Raz superstar like Malachi Lawrence. But in this case, is the juice worth the squeeze? And we'll get into that as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So we live in a world where we can stream anything, order food in minutes, and carry supercomputers in our pockets. But somehow buying tickets to a live game still feels too complicated, right? We got hidden fees, jumping prices, endless steps. There has to be a better way. And now there is. And that's why I use Game Time. It gives the advantage back to the fans and makes getting tickets simple and easy, whether we're talking NFL games, concert, comedy, music, theater, whatever you're into, right? You can see the panoramic seat views for every seat before you buy. right? That gives you peace of mind that you're not going to get any surprises when you show up, and you're not going to get any surprises at checkout, right? Because the price you see is the price you pay, because there's no hidden fees at checkout. So all you need is 2 taps and you will have great seats locked in. It's fast, it's easy, and now it's done. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets by downloading Game Time app, create an account, and use code Locked On, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Game Time today. So wrapping up today's episode with Kevin Knight's 4th round selection, Damonte Capehart, the D tackle out of Clemson, had another promising tester at the combine, another RAS superstar, 9.97 RAS score. So 99.7th percentile. That's the highest among the D tackles that tested at the combine, mostly because of the blazing 40 that he ran for his size, a 4.85 at 313 pounds. That if you adjust that, to weight adjusted 40, the speed score, that was the second highest among D tackles, with Zane Durant slightly edging him out. But that speed score, and I don't have a complete data set or anything like that, but it was something, I tried to track a little bit after that 22 draft where Jordan Davis and Trayvon Walker destroyed the combine. I'm like, whoa, good, and started paying a little bit more attention to those weight adjusted scores. But looking at a couple of D tackles, that speed score for Damonte Capehart would be somewhere between Dontari Poe and Fletcher Cox. So in good company, right? So he's 6'5", 313, nearly 7-foot wingspan, 85th percentile wingspan there. You like the tools, right? And for a team that preaches get off, right, from Nate Ollie, there's upside there when it comes to that type of speed and explosiveness. Now, the knock on Capehart is going to be the lack of production. 13.5 tackles for loss across 6 seasons, 57 games played, and just 3 sacks. And for the sake of comparison, if you just look at Ruke Orhorhoro coming from that same defense, his last 2 seasons at Clemson, where he played 26 games, he had 9 sacks, 3 times as many as Capehart, and 16 tackles for loss. So exceeded Capehart's 6-year career in just his last 2 years. And we know that Ruke was a raw, toolsy sort of guy coming out from that same program. And, it's not to say that production is the end-all, be-all, or the be-all, end-all. But it is kind of a red flag when you have a D tackle that is not very disruptive in college, or at least an orange flag, let's say that, right? Because as we often say on this podcast, it only is going to get harder in the pros with better competition. Now, another knock on Capehart, even though we're talking about potential and upside, he is an older prospect. He's going to turn 24 in July. You compare that to Ruke, who was 22 when we drafted him. And the expectation is, given Capehart's age and experience, he should be a little further along in his stage of his career, right? And so it does make you wonder, okay, how much untapped potential is there in him despite this athleticism that we're talking about? Now, age obviously can be overstated, but like you do wonder, okay, if it is going to take 3 years to develop this guy, what is our, it gives us a relatively small window of production. Now, granted, Capehart, what he does well is stop the run, and run defense typically ages better than pass rush at that D tackle position in the NFL, but you do wonder a little bit about that. Now, because of the Ruke Orhorhoro experience of taking a, toolsy, raw project from Clemson, a prospect like Capehart doesn't necessarily get me as excited today in 2026 as maybe it would have gotten me, 3 years ago or something like that, because there's just feels like too much overlap between Ruke Orhorhoro watching Capehart's film and watching Ruke's film from the same school, same, very similar players, right? They're both kind of underdeveloped pass rushers. Capehart mostly wins with power. We've seen that's Ruke's also best trait as well, right? That's the thing that has translated the most to his success in the NFL as a pass rusher, and that was also the thing that he utilized the most at Clemson. They're both capable run defenders. When we drafted Ruke, I remember saying on the podcast, being like, well, he's not that productive versus the run, relatively speaking, but he's 2.5 times more productive if we're basing it off of TFLs than Capehart was against the run, And so, it feels like Capehart's kind of a lesser version of Ruke, right? But the big difference is you're getting Capehart in round 4 versus trading away a third and moving up in round 2 to get Ruke, right? The value is going to be much better on a round 4 selection of Capehart and that type of prospect, taking a project D tackle like him on day 3 versus when you factor in what the Falcons gave up to go get Ruke. Essentially, they were giving up late first round value for a project type of player. But ultimately, with Capehart, you got to find something that's going to distinguish you from what we already have at the D tackle position. And to me, the one thing that he could do is bulk up, right, and be more of that true nose tackle, right? That he's 313. I'm like, let's get him up to 325 or higher, and let's see if we can turn him into a true nose tackle with that wide wingspan, the two gap, hold and anchor at the line of scrimmage. Most of his best reps come bullying guards and centers, so let's lean into that. But again, that's why he's a little bit of a project, right? Because is he going to have a high floor as a nose tackle coming into the league? Probably not, right? He's not going to come in and take the job away from LaCale London or whoever else, any other veteran that the Falcons potentially bring in this offseason to man that nose tackle position, right? And it kind of goes back to a conversation we had with Jarvis 2 weeks ago, or a week, 10 days ago, whenever it was, during and before the combine, where we were talking about, testing versus film, right? What does your film tell us you are? What does your testing tell us you are? And do they match up, right? And to me, watching the film of Capehart, and again, I haven't done a deep dive, but watched a couple of games, he kind of has like 6th-round film, right? But, the testing, if especially if you're a RAS guy, is like top 100 testing, right? And so if he had a more developed skill set that the Falcons already lacked, I think that would be a much more intriguing bet that is worthwhile for the Falcons. But, I feel like there's still too much overlap. But another factor that plays into why I'm lower on Capehart than maybe others would be is the Shrine Bowl, right? Now, I wasn't there at the Shrine Bowl. It was the Senior Bowl instead. But the various reports I've seen suggested that he was kind of underwhelming in the one-on-ones during that week. There's a couple of clips floating out there of him winning, but like you'll probably only see the same 2 reps and 3 days of practice, and you only have 2 reps that exist showcasing your skill set. That kind of tells you something. But not to knock Kevin's mock, but to me, at least my evaluation of Capehart, and obviously other people will have different opinions, but it feels much more like taking a D tackle to take a D tackle, as opposed to taking someone that actually at that D tackle position legitimately moves the needle for this team. Now, different team that doesn't already have Orhorhoro, doesn't already have LaCale London, doesn't already have Brandon Dorlus, maybe Capehart would move the needle a lot more for those teams. But for the Falcons, it just kind of feels like you're drafting a career backup in a point in the draft where there's probably at other positions, maybe not D tackle, but other positions where you can get maybe someone that has a little bit more upside to be a starter in this league, right? Or at least it comes in with a higher floor so that you can get maybe more positive contributions in those first couple of years than you would get with Damonte Capehart. So that is my thoughts on this mock draft from Kevin Knight. Good job by Kevin. Love the Lawrence pick. I like the Brazzell pick. It's just, I'm not like, oh yeah, Chris Brazzell's my guy, right? And then, the Capehart pick is just like, all right, I get it, but like, it's like, meh, yeah. So those are my thoughts on the first 3 picks in Kevin Knight's mock draft. Obviously, we will continue our coverage all week long with free agency, and our next episode, we'll see, right? I recorded yesterday's episode, the most recent episode, like an hour before Khalil Mack signed, and then talked about on that episode, like, oh, we should sign Khalil Mack. And, part of me is kind of waiting to see, what happens in the waning hours of Sunday night before the legal tampering period kicks off on Monday, before deciding what the next episode is going to be. But if nothing stands out to me, we might get into the kicker conversation, right? Because a bunch of kickers signed Sunday morning to extensions, and we're just kind of, are the Falcons going to do the same thing with Zane Gonzalez? And that may be worthwhile having a conversation. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Locked On NFL, Locked On NFL Draft, especially if you want to get maybe differing thoughts on some of these prospects that we're talking about. And of course, check out the Everydayer Club. If you never miss an episode, the Everydayer Club is built for you. Get Locked On Falcons ad-free, plus members-only Discord access, and so much more. And you can get a free month if you use the code FREEAGENCY with no spaces by heading over to the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. So go check it out. And that's going to do it for us here, guys. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.